Hello and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Now once again we're drawn to inflation in Europe, or rather deflation, as the markets aren't quite convinced yet of Mario Draghi's movements this year. Well, a man who can talk to me all about that is in the studio today. Pierre Mouton, member of the Asset Allocation Committee at Notz Stucki, is here in the studio. Pierre, welcome.
Thank you.
So some would argue wage and asset deflation will be the main cause of a deflationary period in Europe, if it comes. Will this mean Europe could go back to where it was at the start of the financial crisis in 2008, do you think? Could it be that extreme?
Well, what happened at the beginning of 2008 was the consequence of what happened before, so it has to be reminded that in the period 2005, 2004, 2008, there has been like a credit bubble which has led to asset bubbles, especially in the southern countries, as we all know. And that has led, in my view, to the crisis that we know and the deflationary pressures that we see today that keep on going. And you can see on the chart
we've got this graph here essentially showing some of that.
So you can see that wages have gone far too high in the period 2000, 2007, 2008 in Spain and Ireland, for example, and the contraction now that these countries have to live with is the consequence of what happened before, and this leads obviously to very, very strong deflationary pressures in these countries. So that means that we have asset deflation and wage deflation. So it is not a surprise that you have very strong deflationary pressures in Europe because of that. Whereas, as you can see on the chart, Germany did not have this wage bubble in the previous period, and it has even gone down before the rest of the other countries. So Germany has kept a very, very strong competitiveness compared to the rest of the.
It's quite a contrast, and when you look at Ireland there around sort of 2009, reaching 220 at one point. I mean, that really is a contrast between Germany and Ireland.
So that made the situation impossible to handle with, especially in a single currency system where the correction cannot be made by the currency. So it has to be made by something else. And for the countries where you saw this very, very high level of wages and asset bubbles, it has to go through, if it does not come through the currency, which obviously is not the case here, it has to go through asset deflation and wage deflation, because in a single currency you don't control the interest rates either.
Now, some people say, you know, we need higher inflation. So if we were to look at it the other way around, and we were to see too much inflation, well, a very high amount, wouldn't that be an overall burden though on governments? Because, you know, at the end of the day, you've got a situation where interest rates with deflation could go lower, and obviously if we have much higher inflation, that's a positive thing. But there is still too much height in inflation, isn't there?
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, we need inflation, and that's why the target of the ECB is the right one in my view. 2% would be a good level of inflation overall for Europe. If it goes much higher than that, it becomes a real problem, because then you don't control the longer part of the yield curve, which means that if governments have to refinance, they will refinance at higher levels. Companies will have to refinance at higher levels, and households who want to borrow money will have to borrow very expensively. But if you can have inflation controlled around 2% more or less, that is something that is added to GDP. And it means that your GDP, nominal GDP, will grow around maybe, say, 4 to 5%. And so you have this part of the economy that is growing, whereas the debt burden will be limited because the stock of debt is not refinanced every year. So that's very important, and that's why I think the ECB is trying to trigger some kind of inflation to have this kind of relief for countries that are very much indebted. Okay,
so you mentioned there the ECB trying to find a way of triggering that inflation, but what can be done then? Because, I mean, you know, Mario Draghi and the ECB haven't really alluded to alternative options, really. There's been some discussion of QE, but perhaps it's time to put QE to bed, maybe, because we don't want necessarily the markets to be operating in a false environment for too long, because it's not going to last forever. So what do you think is the next next step? What needs to be done, do you think, for this inflation to rise?
Okay, so coming back to the beginning of your question, it has to be also reminded that inflation in deflationary periods can be very long and very painful. We've seen that in Japan, we've seen that in the US in the 30s. So 4 or 5 years of QE, it's not very important. And if we talk about Europe specifically, the level of QE is not very high. I mean, the programs that has been done has been reimbursed mostly by banks to the ECB. So the amount of QE in Europe is quite low today. So that gives the ECB plenty of options to trigger inflation and to revive the economic activity if necessary.
With more QE?
With eventually more QE. There are many things that can be done. They can still lower interest rates. So that's, I mean, they're already quite low, but they can still get them much lower than when they are today. They can go to zero eventually. That's the first point. The ECB can also try, maybe it's difficult, but try to get the euro lower than where it is today. I think that one of the outcomes of this will be that the solution would be to lower the euro, making the southern countries more competitive. That would help very much, and it would not be a problem for Germany or the Netherlands or the other countries. And then what could do the ECB, and this is real QE, would be to try to help small and medium-sized companies borrow cheaply, very cheaply. And that is not the case yet in Europe. Small and medium-sized companies borrow at very high levels still, compared with the level of inflation and the level of activity.
And those banks are still a bit too shy to lend, you know.
So what couldn't be done then is the ECB could lend money to the banks so that they lend money to small and medium-sized companies, because the ECB can't lend directly to companies.
Pierre, just finally, because obviously, I mean, this idea of improving lending abilities has been going on for a while, but doesn't this really also lie in employment and wages? I mean, isn't that the key, the real key here, to get people back into work, to get more people back into work, and then we'll see a much quicker improvement in Europe? Is that not really the key?
Yes, that's for sure, but that's the second part of the program. You must first allow the companies to grow, and if they grow, they will hire people and eventually raise wages. We've seen that in Germany. I mean, in Germany, unemployment is quite low, and wages are starting to rise. I even saw, I think this week, that in the public sector there has been a vote for probably 6% wage inflation over the next 2 years, which is very good, and that's part of the normal process. So if we can trigger economic activity in the southern countries much stronger than what it is today,
they won't be called the periphery anymore. They'll be, they'll be part of everywhere.
But in this case, you have hiring and wage inflation, and in this case, I mean, we will see the situation really improving.
Pierre, thank you. It's definitely a subject we've got to keep an eye on, so I'm sure you'll be back in the studio at some point again. Thank you very much for coming in today.
You're welcome.